the people were looking for an excuse to round up and punish them. Enter the Christians. In the 30-odd years since the death of Christ, nascent Christian communities had begun cropping up throughout the empire. At first, they were primarily Jewish in character, but through the missionary work of St. Paul, known later as the Apostle to the Gentiles, this new religion began to spread into the Greco-Roman world. By the reign of Nero, a tiny community of believers, led, according to tradition, by St. Peter, had established a religious beachhead in Rome itself. The problem the early Christians faced in Rome, though, was not just that their religion, in comparison to the wider pagan world, struck the average Roman as downright weird, but also that at this point, most Christian adherents were non-citizen resident aliens of the city, who spoke primarily Greek or Hebrew. So the Christians in Rome looked different, spoke a different language, usually came from the lower rungs of the social ladder, and belonged to a strange monotheistic cult that seemed to have cannibalistic overtones. All in all, they were capital O other in every sense of the word, and as has been proven over and over again by history, whenever terrible things happen to a community, economic problems, floods, plagues, fires, it is the capital O others who usually get blamed. So, desperate to shift responsibility for the Great Fire away from himself, Nero looked at these others and decided to lay it all on them. He sent out his agents into the city and had them round up as many identified Christians as they could find, drag them into dark rooms, and torture them until they admitted to starting the fire. These confessions in hand, Nero then decided to expand his persecution beyond some limited group of conspirators and target the Christian community as a whole. According to Tacitus, Nero embarked on his persecution with a cruel zeal. Christians were thrown to the dogs for public amusement, crucified and left to die, or, perhaps most gruesomely, crucified and then burnt alive to serve as torches for Nero's nightly parties. But if Nero was hoping that he could regain the public's favor by torturing Christians, he underestimated the humanity of the masses. Sure, the Christians are weird and nobody really wants them around, but at a certain point, burning them alive for sport, while you and your friends watch and drink yourselves stupid? Really? That seems a bit. The Christians grew, while Nero wound up even more unpopular than he had been when he started. So you could say that the plan backfired. I should also note that while it is not confirmed that St. Peter himself was caught up specifically in the Great Fire persecution, tradition does have him being crucified by the Romans at some point in the mid-60s AD. St. Peter's Basilica, the beating heart of the Catholic Church, is allegedly built upon the spot where he was buried. As unpopular as Nero was becoming with the people of Rome, their dissatisfaction paled in comparison to the feelings of the Christians themselves, who now came to revile Nero with an understandable fury. It has been suggested, I think plausibly, that the reference in the book of Revelations to 666, being the number of the beast, is a coded reference to Nero. I'm not going to get into the specifics of Jewish numerology, but basically, if you take the Greek spelling of Nero's name and translate it into Hebrew, you are left with a name that has the numerological value of 666. After Nero's suicide, there was a great deal of speculation, especially in the East, that Nero had not really died and was poised to make a dramatic comeback at any time. Fearful of Roman reprisals for speaking against the Caesars, but still wishing to warn their brethren about the threat that Nero posed, the early Christians used numerology to code in a reference for those with the wisdom to see. I think it's fair to say, too, that one of the primary reasons Nero has such a terrible historical reputation is that around about the 4th century, the Church Fathers got a hold of the history books and saw no reason to paint Nero as anything more than a demonic monster. While that perhaps went too far, even in his own time, Nero was fast running out of defenders. The people no longer trusted him, and the aristocracy, well, they hadn't liked him from the beginning. Like most autocrats, Nero had come to the throne promising greater power for the Senate and a lighter imperial hand. But before long, as usual, those promises were forgotten, and the Senate returned to its natural state of irrelevancy. While this irrelevancy suited many men who were members primarily for the social status it conferred upon them, there was still a core group of senators who either had an interest in good governance for its own sake, or had personal political ambitions that they thought membership in the Senate could advance. In either case, Nero's actions in the early to mid-60s AD inflamed both. The emperor was slashing taxes while increasing public works projects and diverting funds into the construction of his palace, which now featured a 120-foot statue of himself looking down upon the city, all of which left the state teetering on the brink of insolvency. This, of course, offended the good government types. At the same time, if you weren't a part of Nero's inner circle of friends, good luck advancing your career. Nero played favorites early and often, and there were dozens of powerful men who didn't get on with the emperor personally, which left them out in the cold politically. This, of course, offended the ambitious types. These various offenses bubbled under the surface until a formal conspiracy to assassinate Nero coalesced around Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Piso was a distinguished statesman and orator who enjoyed a fine reputation at all levels of Roman society and who had been watching the devolution of Nero's reign with disgust. If Rome could be ruled again by a man of talent like Augustus, rather than men like his incompetent and insane descendants, the empire might thrive again, rather than simply stagnate, as it seemed to be doing. Piso, a man of modest ego, decided that the very best candidate to rule Rome, if the criteria was basic merit, was himself. Details of the plot remain sketchy, but it seems as though Piso had secured the support of Tigellinus's Praetorian prefect colleague, Finius Rufus, and the two men had agreed that upon the assassination of Nero, however that went down, Rufus would lead Piso to the Praetorian camp, where Piso would be declared the new emperor. Dozens of men in the Senate, in the imperial bureaucracy, and in the army eventually joined in the word-of-mouth conspiracy, including Seneca the Younger. But before the plan could be initiated, it was betrayed. When a young officer was heard complaining that his career had stalled because Nero didn't like him, he was approached about joining the growing plot. But rather than join, he decided to use the information he obtained to betray the plot as a means of currying favor with the emperor. Though the young officer lacked details, he put the imperial court on notice that a sizable chunk of the aristocracy was actively plotting the regime's downfall. In April of 65 AD, a freedman's secretary confirmed the existence of the plot and provided the details that Nero's agents were looking for. Piso and everyone else were either ordered to commit suicide or were exiled to the provinces. Seneca committed suicide. The Pisonian conspiracy represented a very real threat to Nero. It was not some ham-fisted caper. It was a well-orchestrated plot that involved some of the most prominent men in Rome. Scared out of his wits that now everyone was out to get him, an increasingly paranoid Nero reinitiated indiscriminate treason trials, the bloody calling card of imperial insecurity. The trials, of course, only entrenched the aristocratic hatred of Nero, and in a few short years he would find himself fleeing his golden palace, friendless, and officially an enemy of the state. I'm going to leave it there for this week. Next time, we'll hop back and forth between the final stages of Nero's reign and the Great Revolt that erupts in Judea in 66 AD. And after that, I'll lay the groundwork for the Year of the Four Emperors, the death of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and the rise of the new Flavian dynasty that took its place once all the dust had settled. But before we take off into that next phase of Roman history, as some of you have already noticed, the history of Rome will be going off the air for about 4 weeks, following the September 13th episode. I am getting married on September the 23rd, and then immediately moving from Portland, Oregon to Austin, Texas. So, long story short, I am going to be a very busy man, and will not be able to pay my little podcast the attention it deserves. I want to direct all of you back to thehistoryofrome.typepad.com, where I have posted a brief message on all of this, and also address the growing movement to have me keep going with this thing until the fall of Constantinople is most likely not going to happen. So, after this, we'll have 3 more episodes, the last of which will probably be a fun episode dedicated to Roman wedding customs, because, hey, right now it's basically wedding stuff all the time for me, so why should the history of Rome be any different? Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 67, What an Artist the World is Losing. Nero had dodged a bullet in 65 AD when the far-reaching Pisonian conspiracy was exposed before it had a chance to act. Thus far, Nero had been living his life with a sort of flippant disregard for the aristocracy, obsessed about his standing with the masses, sure, but not really giving a hoot what a bunch of crusty old senators thought about him. But after the plot was discovered, Nero was exposed to a reality that he had never really considered before. Not only were powerful men unhappy with him, but they were willing to go to extreme lengths to express their unhappiness. And not only were they willing to go to extreme lengths to express their unhappiness, but, except for one lucky break, they had almost gone to them. Nero suddenly realized that his reign and his life existed in a far more precarious place than he had previously thought. Now this is the point where a more introspective man, aided by wise counsel, might examine the roots of the aristocracy's displeasure and wonder what he, Nero, might be able to do to mute their anger. Were there things he did that were unnecessarily inflammatory? And that, if he knocked off the more extreme stuff, maybe he could avoid perpetually dealing with plots against his life? But Nero was not an introspective man, and his counsel was not wise. So, rather than repent his extravagances and grow up a little, he decided to dig in his heels. And if anyone didn't like it, well, there were always treason trials for the incorrigible. But as is so often the case, show trials and indiscriminate persecutions create far more enemies than they destroy, and in a few short years, Nero will reap the full blowback for his actions. 65 was not just a bad year for Nero because it was very nearly his last, but also because his wife Poppaea, mother of his daughter and pregnant with his second, died during the summer. There are conflicting reports about her death, with some surmising that Poppaea died naturally during childbirth, as often occurred in the ancient world. But of course, the more famous and salacious version offered by Suetonius and Tacitus is that, over the course of an argument, Nero became enraged and repeatedly kicked her in the stomach until she and the unborn child were dead. Whichever way it occurred, Nero became almost insane with grief, or remorse depending on the version of the story you believe. And rather than cremating Poppaea, he had her stuffed and embalmed so that he could visit her in the imperial mausoleum. In the years after her death, Nero would delve even deeper into his singing, acting, and chariot racing career, culminating in 67 with his participation in the Olympic Games. Despite being thrown and nearly dying from a 10-horse chariot and delivering amateurish singing and acting performances, Nero won the victory crowns for every competition he entered. It was still good to be the king. While Nero was off pretending to be some great entertainer, in the Far East, the Romans became embroiled in what would prove to be the first of several major revolts in the combustible province of Judea. That the first of these is known simply as the Great Revolt is all you need to know about the impact the conflict will have on the history of the world. We won't be able to finish the whole thing today, as in between the beginning and the end of it, the whole Year of the Four Emperors things happen, but we can at least get it started along its way. Trouble had been brewing in Judea from the moment the Romans first showed up in the region. Pompey the Great had famously entered the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem over the vehement protests of the high priest, which pretty much got the Romans and Jews off on the wrong foot. A short